Let's go into a little more detail on photosynthesis in this presentation. I want to remind us that the entire screen that you see here represents the chloroplast. So there is another membrane that we don't see here, and then this is the inner membrane, the thylakoid membrane. And you can see that is illustrated right here in the light-dependent reactions which are happening within that membrane and then also in this thylakoid space. This is the electron transport chain, so you can imagine that we are moving electrons through, and you can see electrons indicated in green all the way across. So let's figure out where the electrons are coming from, where they're going to, and what we do with that. If we start with photosystem 1, there are photons or sunlight that hits the chlorophyll, the green chlorophyll circles here. And when the photons hit, it bumps electrons out of the chlorophyll molecules altogether. Those electrons move through different molecules like ferredoxin here, and then you can see them moving into along the electron transport chain. And if we want to keep using these chlorophyll molecules, we need to replace the electrons that these photons have bumped out. So that's where we come all the way back here to photosystem 2. And photosystem 2, we can see photons are going to hit chlorophyll molecules, electrons are going to be bounced out, and you can see the electrons showing up here, right? They're being passed through plastoquinone and then to the cytochrome complex, which is also called B6F. And then they move through plastoquinone, and eventually they come here to photosystem 1, and they replace the electrons that were bumped out by this photon. Now we have to ask what happens to the electrons that this photon is bumping out of photosystem 2. That's where water comes into play. Water is broken down into oxygen, hydrogen ions, and electrons. It's these electrons that came from water that are replacing the electrons in the chlorophyll molecules in photosystem 2. The photons are bumping electrons out of chlorophyll molecules within photosystem 2. They are replaced by electrons that come from water. That is water's role, to replace electrons in chlorophyll. Now let's consider the energy. We know that we started with energy from the sun. I then said that we use that energy in the form of electrons, moving electrons. And one of the things that you have heard of before is that we use that energy to move hydrogen ions across this membrane. And that cytochrome C will actually take the energy from the electrons and will move the hydrogen ions into this space so that downstream the ions can move through ATP synthase. Remember that molecule similar to the one in mitochondria that twists, and in that twisting we capture the energy and we make ATP molecule from that. So the solar energy moved to bouncing electrons, moved to hydrogen ions being pumped against their gradient, to allowing them to move through this ATP synthase, and now I get ATP. The other output of this is the NADPH is going to combine with hydrogen and this electron right here, and it's going to become NADPH. So when we leave this first step, it's NADPH and ATP that I'm going to take into the next step, which is a Calvin cycle.